Mm. Okay. Sorry this has been taking so long. I hope to speed it up now. The computer's been moving very, very slowly. I also had a bit of an interruption at the start because Microsoft decided to update my computer just at the moment when I was setting out to live stream. So that has caused a delay. And then my computer has been a little balky when it comes to sharing stuff also. So excuse me for being so relatively late tonight. Uh, I will, however, talk about all the things I intended to talk about in any case. So here we go. Let me see how you're doing, first of all. Hi, Sam Woods. Hi, Dolores Pierce. Hi, Lana and Steve. And also Andrew Dianaska. Very nice to see you too. Welcome. Okay, welcome to you all. Please share for me. I've done a bit of sharing to start us off, but of course I need a lot more. Yeah, hi, Steve. Good to see you here. Uh, and Dolores, it's very good to see you too. Oh, oh, what do you know? I gave this one the wrong title. That was the title for the last one. So excuse me a second and let me edit this post. I'm sorry. Okay, edit the video. I have to change the name. I think I can do that. Hmm. Except my computer doesn't want to cooperate. Oh. Hmm. Hmm. Okay, sorry I'm having trouble tonight. Okay, I made actually an initial mistake by not changing the title from last time. I'll have to correct that, okay, at a later time. I see I'm not able to do it now. I also see my picture is frozen, but I think it'll get unfrozen in just a minute. So, anyway, what I wanted to begin with tonight was legal ways for foreign governments to influence our politics. I thought that topic was a very interesting topic because, of course, in creating the Constitution, in creating the Constitution, the founders took pains to try to write the Constitution in such a way that it would be very difficult for foreign governments to affect our domestic politics. That was a concern actually from the very start. So there's an article which appeared in Truth Out, which covers what the current situation is with other governments interfering in our politics. And this, of course, is a very current question as well, because everybody went absolutely crazy when there was evidently some effort by the Russians to affect the 2016 elections. So let me begin to tackle that now. If my computer will cooperate, I'm not at all sure that it will tonight. Here we go. Okay, so here we are at Truth Out. The article I want to talk about is called "The Perfectly Legal Ways Foreign Powers Subvert US Democracy." And the article was written by Ryan Summers and Ben Freeman of Tom Dispatch and was published on November 12th. You can see it better now. Nice picture. It starts by saying foreign influence in America is the topic of the day. That is the topic du jour. From the impeachment inquiry into President Trump's request that a foreign power investigate a political opponent, and to the indictment of associates of his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, for illegally funneling foreign money into U.S. elections, the nation has been transfixed by news of illegal foreign influence in the political process. While such efforts to subvert American elections garner headlines, there remains a treasure trove of perfectly legal ways foreign powers are subverting American democracy. They're not waiting for election day, they're doing it every single day of the year. Quote, legislation is prepared by lobbyists all the time, unquote. And of course, there are foreign lobbyists, registered lobbyists, representing foreign powers. And these lobbyists actually script what various members of Congress say. That may sound wild, say the authors, but it's actually commonplace. Li Fang of The Intercept reported a typical example of this recently. He discovered that on November 13th, 2017, Representative Ed Royce, a Republican from California, then chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, read verbatim into the congressional record a set of talking points given to his office by lobbyists working for the Saudi government. As Representative Ro Khanna and a bipartisan group of lawmakers debated invoking the War Powers Act to end support of the U.S. for the war in Yemen, Ari Friedman, a lobbyist working for Hogan, working for Hogan Lovells itself, representing Saudi Arabia, distributed talking points to Royce and others. In a C-SPAN video from the debate on the floor, Royce can be seen parroting these very talking points word for word. This might seem like an extraordinary success for any lobbyist of a foreign power, but it's actually quite common. A report by the Project on Government Oversight, POGO, co-authored by Ben Freeman, for instance, documented multiple examples of foreign agents writing speeches, even legislation, say, for members of Congress. And then he goes on with a number of examples for this. The thing to remember is that there is proposed legislation prepared by lobbyists all the time. In our post-citizens united world, where thanks to the decision of the Supreme Court in 2010, the spending of money is considered speech when it comes to campaign finance. Agents working on behalf of foreign governments regularly, quote, speak, quote unquote, with their pocketbooks. The Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative at the Center for International Policy, the CIP, where we work, has repeatedly reported on how agents of foreign governments make campaign contributions to the congressional, the the congressional representatives they're contacting on behalf of foreign powers. Sometimes they even make such donations on the very day they meet with the members of Congress. In investigating the Saudi lobby in 2018, we found at least 5 instances when lawmakers received campaign contributions on the day they or their staff spent time with someone working for the Saudis. Firms that were representing the Saudis gave this way to Senator Jim Inhofe and Senator Robert Menendez, a Democrat of New Jersey, Senator Tina Smith, a Democrat of Minnesota, Senator Ben Cardin, who's a Democrat of Maryland, and Representative Mike Conaway, Republican of Texas. Even more striking are contacts and contributions made just prior to important votes on Capitol Hill. Senator Bill Nelson, for instance, received a total of $3,000 from Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck, a firm representing the Saudis. In the 4 days before a March 20th, 2018 vote on a war powers resolution introduced to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. One of those contributions came on the day of the vote. Nelson, who has since lost his Senate seat, ended up voting against the Yemen resolution in line with Saudi interests. While foreign nationals are prohibited from making campaign contributions, exactly what the presidential lawyer and former New York mayor Rudy Giuliani's Ukrainian associates are accused of orchestrating, nothing prohibits citizens working on their behalf from such donations. Some would argue that gestures of this sort look remarkably like actual bribery, but they're perfectly legal according to the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. As long as any contributions an agent reports, quote, are from your own funds and on your own behalf, unquote. So as long as I register, it's actually possible for contributions. It's actually possible for me to make contributions, quote, from my own funds and on my own behalf, even if those funds have originated from a foreign power. The next is buying think tank thinking. Foreign powers have ample ability through their lobbyists to directly influence the laws passing through Congress. They have at least 3 indirect, perfectly legal avenues for trying to shift our foreign policy in their favor: think tanks, the media, and academia. SCIP's recent report on the influence of the UAE, which is the United Arab Emirates in America. The lobbyists hired by foreign powers often work directly with influential think tanks to shape the narrative about the countries they represent. They meet with think tank experts, they provide them with talking points, they offer research assistance, sometimes even give them all expense-paid trips to the country in question. Such talking points are disseminated to think tank pundits, in part to influence what they'll write or say. Their work, in turn, is often shared by various congressional offices. This process is effectively talking point laundering. A foreign power's message is communicated to sympathetic think tank experts, who then echo the talking points in their work speeches, or even testimony before Congress without having to disclose their connections to that country. So I have a think tank. It's called the Center for the Public Purpose. Now I presume that I could communicate easily a foreign power's message, but to Congress. For example, the talking points, of the Venezuelan government in my work, my speeches, or even testimony before Congress, without having to disclose any connections I have to that particular country. What a cozy arrangement. For example, as our UAE report documented, Michael Knights, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, has an extremely close relationship with lobbyists working on behalf of the UAE, and his public comments often echo their talking points. An article Knights wrote on June 14, 2018, on the UAE's move to liberate, quote unquote, the Yemeni port of Hodeida, deeply embroiled in the Saudi UAE war in that embattled land, closely mirrored an article disseminated by I guess it's Hajir Elouad and Associates, a firm working on behalf of that country. It in turn had been written by Anwar Gargash, the current UAE Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. So, a mouthpiece for the UAE Minister of Foreign Affairs. How wonderful. Farah filings show as well that Knights has a very close relationship with by Richard Mintz, managing director of the Harbor Group, which also represents the UAE in Washington. He reportedly coordinated with Knights on 4 separate trips to visit the UAE forces in Yemen. Afterward, Knights would write a distinctly uncritical analysis about the UAE operations in Yemen, never, for instance, mentioning the targeted assassination program that UAE officials oversaw there, or the fact that those same forces gave by U.S. supplied weapons to Al-Qaeda and other militant groups in that country. He also dismissed accusations of war crimes by UAE forces as just the work of, quote, local proxies, unquote. While registered foreign agents legally have to declare anything they distribute on behalf of a foreign power, there is no such requirement for think tank experts. In fact, such institutions don't even have to disclose that they receive funding from foreign powers. Under current law, it's perfectly legal for scholars whose work is funded by a foreign government to craft an article with that government's registered foreign agents. In other words, they can be co-authors of the article without disclosing any of their ties. I guess then technically they can't be co-authors because I can't really disclose the ties. Okay, but they could help me to craft that article. And I could sign my name to the article. And I wouldn't have to disclose any of their ties, or even that they were actual co-authors of the article. This can become a particularly this can become highly problematic when such experts testify before Congress without disclosing their potential conflicts of interest. The House of Representatives requires witnesses to fully reveal foreign funding before testifying, but in many instances, such experts don't disclose the money their institutions receive from foreign governments. A POGO report found that the existing House rule relating to testimonial transparency is remarkably weak, allowing many witnesses to adopt a particularly narrow interpretation of the issues related to their testimony. In the process, they simply don't disclose their foreign ties. Oh, how sweet it is. Experts from the Atlantic Council, which received at least $2,585,000 in foreign funding, that can support quite a few staff people, don't you think? In 2018, for example, failed to disclose this funding when appearing before Congress. Perhaps, but most notably, two Atlantic Council experts who testified on, quote, reforming the National Security Council, unquote, and, quote, defeating terrorism in Syria, unquote, didn't reveal the more than $1 million the Atlantic Council received from the UAE Embassy in Washington, even though the UAE undoubtedly had an interest in each of those issues. Then there's the next way of doing this is shaping the media narrative. So our media outlets are another prime target of foreign influence operations. Some governments, of course, run their own media outlets in America, and many of these are required to register under the the FARA. China's CCTV and Russia's RT, which was deemed, quote, the Kremlin's principal international propaganda outlet, unquote, in the Director of National Intelligence's report on Russian interference in the 2016 election, are obvious examples. And of course, foreign powers continue to engage in a number of illegal Twitter and Facebook activities meant to influence domestic politics, as well as American views of their own countries. Last I heard, I didn't think that the BBC was actually required to register under FARA, and I don't recall the French organ. I forget exactly what it's called, but similar to the BBC. I didn't find that they had to register as agents of a foreign power. We seem to be reserving that privilege for Chinese outlets, and Russia outlets, but not for the outlets of nations we like. But nevertheless, those outlets are still free to broadcast and still free to influence. And they have networks here, stations here, and they influence us every day. They shape the narrative of the media. And of course, foreign powers continue to engage in a number of illegal Twitter and Facebook activities meant to influence domestic politics, as well as American views of their own countries. In early November, for example, two former Twitter employees were charged with spying for Saudi Arabia and accessing the private income of the private information of the kingdom's critics in the United States. Generally ignored, however, are the ways in which foreign powers often engage in legal media manipulation that neither they nor such outlets are required to tell viewers or listeners about. One of the most common tactics is simply to work closely with reporters covering issues of importance to them. No surprise, then, that the Center for International Policy's investigations have consistently found journalists among the top targets of registered foreign agents. In some cases, it's fairly easy to see how this influence gets converted into extremely positive spin on their behalf. Take, for example, OZY, Ozzy, which brands itself as, quote, news for the disruptive, unquote. Its reporters were contacted repeatedly by UAE agents in late 2017 and early 2018 regarding story ideas and to arrange interviews. This courtship culminated in two extraordinarily flattering Aussie pieces, one describing Dubai's uh, what they call actually a museum of the future, quote unquote, and the other portraying Dubai as one of the world's new fashion capitals, ignoring the fact that you can face up to 3 years in prison, especially if you're a woman, for dressing inappropriately there. Now that's influence, isn't it? Foreign influence in the ivory tower. While foreign influence in Washington has consistently made front page headlines, it's arguably just as pervasive at our universities. Chinese influence has, for instance, garnered considerable attention in recent years. That country's Confucius Institutes, ostensibly language and cultural centers, at American colleges, paid for by the Chinese government, have been the focus of eye-opening congressional investigations on the role foreign governments can play on campus. As a Senate investigation reported in early 2019, quote, Confucius Institute funding comes with strings that can compromise academic freedom, unquote. Sounds like the Koch brothers. Allowing the Chinese government to play censor at academic conferences on U.S. soil, and even censor course materials critical of China. Chinese influence on campus has garnered headlines, but that country is just one of more than 100 that have funneled $9+ billion in foreign money to U.S. college campuses in the past 5 years. After all, folks, grant money is the name of the game, right? According to the Department of Education, and China isn't even the biggest player among them. That honor, believe it or not, goes to little but wealthy Qatar, which has given more than $1.3 billion to American universities since 2014, nearly 3 times as much as the Chinese. Its officials, in turn, have gone to great lengths to ensure that the strings attached to such funding aren't known to the public. They even sued the state of Texas to prevent Texas A&M, one of its top grantees, from having to disclose the details of its relationship with Qatar. Okay. Well, at least 24 of our universities are severing ties with Confucius Institutes. Schools have been far more reluctant to cut ties with other authoritarian governments. After the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, for example, by universities and in Istanbul, Turkey, for example, our universities and think tanks face considerable pressure to sever ties with Saudi, but few did. Since 2014, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, one of the top universities in terms of prestige and status in this country, of course, has received the most money from the Saudis, at least $77 million, according to the Department of Education records. And that ain't hay. Following outrage after Khashoggi's brutal murder, MIT began a reassessment of its financial ties with the kingdom. However, in February, when that assessment was finished and outrage over Khashoggi's murder was no longer front page news, a letter sent to the school students and teachers concluded that the faculty should be able to continue their current engagements with colleagues, students, and public and private research sponsors in Saudi Arabia, as long as these projects remain consistent with MIT policies and procedures and U.S. laws and our and the laws and regulations of the U.S. Saudi influence on campus can be even more direct than funding. In at least one case, a registered foreign agent working on behalf of that country was a professor on a college campus. According to a report by Brian McGlinchey, an expert on Saudi influence in America, in 2018, Bill Smullen, former chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, was more recently a registered agent working on behalf of Saudi while serving as director of the Maxwell School of National Security Studies at Syracuse University. FARA filings show that Smullen was paid to provide, quote, public relations support, unquote, for the Saudis while serving as the head of that prestigious national security program. When asked if the Saudi money might lead him to show them in a more favorable light at Syracuse, Smullen quickly dismissed the idea, saying, quote, I don't think there is any conflict of interest, unquote. Well, I do think there's a conflict of interest. Who's right, me or him? There's certainly an appearance of a conflict of interest. Has he said anything nasty about the Saudis in the last 10 years? I wonder. Expanding the spotlight to perfectly legal foreign influence, which is another way getting influence. The scrutiny placed on by various actors like Rudy Giuliani's associates, Rudy Giuliani's associates, and their alleged dealings with Ukrainian elites to compromise an American election is certainly warranted. We live in a world in which the ability of foreign powers to undermine American democracy, as this country once undermined democracies elsewhere, strikes me that just this week we undermined a democracy in Bolivia. Remains a genuine threat, to finish that sentence. Seldom, however, does anyone even think about the influence operations of foreign powers. Operations that are perfectly legal and don't garner headlines. The American political system, which has always been vulnerable to outside influence, is arguably more susceptible to foreign meddling now than it has been in decades. And most of it is perfectly legal. From woefully inadequate disclosures regarding conflicts of interest by witnesses testifying before Congress to foreign agents filling campaign coffers and literally writing our laws, as well as influencing think tanks, media outlets, universities, there remain a host of legal ways for foreign powers to try to bend our policies and thinking to their will. While it's imperative that we be vigilant in rooting out illegal foreign influence, American democracy is to remain of the people, by the people, for the people, quote unquote. Oh, that's a joke, isn't it? We ought to direct a bright light onto all forms of influence that seek to undermine it. We certainly should, and we should do more than that. We should prohibit some of the form of influence that seek to undermine it. And a very important way of doing this is to tightly control what kinds of contributions to political campaigns are acceptable and what kinds are not. And there's no doubt but that the CEU decision of 2010 by the Supreme Court has opened the doors to foreign powers being able to almost directly contribute to our campaigns, fill campaign coffers all over the country through third parties, our citizens, who are working for them. and earning a good living by working for them. And then having the representatives who receive these contributions do the will of foreign powers rather than their constituents. We really need to stop this flow of money into our politics in whatever ways we can. I'm sure that a Sanders administration is going to clean up, a good bit of this. It's impossible, of course, to stop all the influence because we're open to the world, as are other notions. So, as long as there's free speech in our country and free press and so on, foreign influences are going to filter in. But we don't have to let them directly get to our representatives in Congress and directly get to the presidency by buying, our office holders. We've got to stop that. And that's perfectly legal in most instances, as is outlined, in this article. Now, it was not perfectly legal for Trump, who in his specific capacity as President of the United States, in the Ukraine situation, asked for an emolument from a foreign government in the form of a favor, which would give him an advantage over a political rival, specifically Joe Biden. Trump, in asking for that, has violated the Constitution. So at least the Constitution is still there to perhaps give us some vehicles for holding somebody accountable for doing something really outrageous, in this particular respect. But it's also true that there are many, many, many other ways for foreign governments to influence our decision-making processes here in the United States. And we have to neutralize those, as best we can, I believe. So let's now close this up and move on to Medicare for All. This article appeared, in Medium, was posted on the National Nurses United blog there. And the article was written by Zene Cortez, who's an RN. And I thought this article was particularly well put and gives things both from the RN point of view, which we don't often see, and also from what it would mean for patients to have their reality change and to have a Medicare for All program instead of what they have now. So let us go through this. It seems particularly appropriate because Bernie Sanders is on the point of getting the formal endorsement, of the NNU on Friday. It's been announced that he will get it, of course, and formally will be done on Friday at a campaign event, I'm sure. So Zene Cortez says, all the talk about how much people would have to spend to transition to Medicare for All obscures the reality that health security has already collapsed with the present insurance-based system for tens of millions of American families today. On cost alone, a new Kaiser Family Foundation chart shows that a family of four with employer coverage earning $50,000 spends 15% of its yearly income, or $7,450, on health coverage in premiums, deductibles, and other out-of-pocket uh, costs and other expenses. If they are in worse health, that jumps up to 19%. Um, um, but to 19%, okay, of their gross income. Other red alerts can be found on social media every day. 1 in 6 Americans who get insurance on the job say they've had to make difficult sacrifices to pay for health care in the past year, such as cutting back on food and moving in with friends or taking on extra work. 1 in 5 say health bills have devoured all or most of their savings. 1/3 of GoFundMe accounts are devoted to campaigns to pay for medical care. There's a picture, okay, of a nurse, somebody in the nurses' campaign to heal America, posting something on a bulletin board. From coast to coast, families are gambling on their health, debating on how long they can go on, okay, ignoring a mortgage or rent payment, a heating bill, or other basic necessities if they get sick or need routine medical care. Nurses see those patients every day. The family that became homeless to pay for leukemia care for a child. Okay. The young adult who delayed signs of heart disease or skipped, okay, an insulin dose and ended up in the emergency room or on life support. Women who postponed treatment after learning they had breast cancer because of high deductibles. Just a few years ago, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau reported that 43 million Americans stagger under medical debt, a number that has undoubtedly risen as prices continue to skyrocket, while fact checkers engage in debates about how many people go bankrupt due to medical bills. Even those with private insurance typically have to pay additional costs for other substantial health services, including dental, vision, hearing, laboratory, and diagnostic services, long-term care, and much more. An appalling 114 million people have no dental coverage at all. That is more than 1/3 of the American population. Yes, our population is now 330 million, and 114 million times 3 is 342 million. So we are looking at more than 1/3 of our population, no dental coverage at all. If you don't have dental coverage, most of the people who don't have dental coverage certainly can't afford to have any dental care at all, because anything serious is enormously expensive. That's what has been lost in much of the media coverage of the debate over Medicare for All. Much less what is at stake with the continued efforts by the Trump administration and congressional Republicans to repeal the Affordable Care Act with its existing coverages. How long can we as a society ignore these symptoms of symptom failure? How long must we allow fear-mongering and healthcare industry talking points to stand in the way of the transformative reform that would guarantee health coverage for all of our nation's residents without the backbreaking costs and heartbreaking health insecurity that burdens so many today? Now consider what happens to family budgets and health insecurity with Medicare for All. Comprehensive coverage, including primary, hospital, emergency, and outpatient care, dental, vision, hearing, and mental health, substance abuse treatment, lab and diagnostic services, also prescription drugs, even long-term care. No insurance premiums or deductibles. No surprise medical bills. In fact, no balance billing at all. No unexpected charges for ambulance transit, and every other inflated charge imposed by an industry that has made profit margins, shareholder dividends, and executive pay packages their holy grail. No narrow networks that bar real choice of hospital, doctor, or clinic. There's a reason why the healthcare industry and the politicians that parrot the rhetoric of the industry are so feverish in attacking Medicare for all. It's because Americans are fed up with a callous, often cruel system that treats them as collateral damage and as a medical loss by ratio, quote unquote. Nurses can testify to what is occurring on the ground. We spent years reminding people it doesn't have to be this way. And we've seen an explosion of support for real change. Tens of thousands, of volunteers today are knocking on doors, talking to their neighbors, calling out legislators, and building a broad movement, the very building blocks of every social change movement in American history. We don't intend to stop. There are 150,000 members of the NNU, and they do not intend to stop. And this week, they're endorsing Bernie Sanders. And now on to Bolivia, the aftermath. An article in Counterpunch by Vijay Prashad, who's a wonderful columnist. After Evo, the lithium question looms large in Bolivia. And this one is dated November 13th, 2019, which is today. So let me get this onto clearly. Okay, and there, is Evo Morales, who, of course, since has had to flee Brazil and go into asylum, in Mexico. He's now, in Mexico. Before he left office, he had been involved in a long project to bring economic and social democracy to his long exploited country. It is important to recall that they've suffered a series of coups, often conducted by the military and the oligarchy, on behalf of transnational transnational mining companies. Initially, these were tin firms, but tin is no longer the main target there. The main target is its massive deposits, of lithium, crucial for the electric car, and crucial also in many batteries used for solar storage as well. Over the past 13 years, one of the main things, that Evo tried to do was to build the different relationship between his country, and its resources. He's not wanted the resources to benefit the transnational mining firms, but rather to benefit the people of that country. Part of that promise was met, as the Bolivia's the poverty rate there has declined sharply. If I'm not mistaken, he was able to cut the poverty rate by more than half, in Bolivia. they, and also Bolivia's population improved on a wide range of social indicators, okay, as well. OECD social indicators. Nationalization of resources combined with the use of its income to fund social development has played a role. The attitude of the Morales government towards the transnational firms has produced a harsh response from them. Many of them taking Bolivia to court over the course of the past few years. It has struggled to raise investment in order to develop the reserves in a way that brings the wealth back into the country for its people. His vice president, Alvaro Garcia Linera, has said, okay, that lithium is the, quote, fuel that will feed the world, unquote. Uh, but however, Bolivia was unable to make deals with Western transnational firms, so it decided to partner with Chinese firms. This made the government of Evo Morales vulnerable. It had walked into the new Cold War between the West and China. The coup against Morales cannot be understood without a glance at this clash. In other words, the context for the coup, okay, is the Morales government bringing in Chinese firms to help with the development of the lithium and its inability to make deals with the multinational corporations from the West. So the United States, of course, decided it was going to help the right wing forces in Bolivia to displace the government with another government that would be more favorable to deals with the Western multinational firms. That, of course, would be more likely to result in essentially looting Bolivia's resources without proper compensation. So VJ then talks about a clash with the transnational firms. When Evo Morales and the Movement for Socialism took power in 2006, the government immediately sought to undo decades of theft by transnational mining firms. The government seized several of the mining operations of the most powerful firms, such as the Glencore, Jindal Steel and Power, the Anglo-Argentine, Anglo-Argentine Pan American Energy, and South American Silver, now Trimetals Mining. It sent a message that business as usual was not going to continue. Nonetheless, these large firms continued their operations based on older contracts in some areas of the country. For example, the Canadian transnational firm South American Silver had created a company in 2003 before Morales came to power to mine the Malkukoda for silver, in indium, which is a rare earth metal used in flat screen TVs. South American Silver then began to extend its reach into its concessions. The land that it claimed was inhabited by indigenous people who argued that the company was destroying its sacred spaces, as well as promoting an atmosphere of violence. August 1, 2012, the Morales government, by Supreme Decree number 1308, actually annulled the contract with South American Silver, which then sought international arbitration and compensation. Canada's government of Justin Trudeau, as part of a broader push on behalf of the Canadian mining companies in South America, put an immense amount of pressure on Bolivia. In August 2019, Trimetals struck a deal with the Bolivian government for $25.8 million, about a tenth of what it had earlier demanded as compensation. Okay, so a good deal was struck, by Evo Morales. He was a tough bargainer, and they got only one tenth of what they asked for. I'm sure under the new government they will get far, far more, than that. I wouldn't be surprised to find the settlement, is renegotiated. Jindal Steel, an Indian transnational corporation, had an old contract to mine the iron ore from the El Mutan, a contract that was put on hold by the Morales government in 2007. In July 2012, Jindal Steel terminated the contract and sought international arbitration and compensation for its investment. In 2014, it won $22.5 million from the country in a ruling from Paris-based International Chamber of Commerce. In another case, Jindal Steel demanded $100 million in compensation. The Morales government seized 3 facilities from the Swiss-based transnational mining firm by Glencore. These included a tin and zinc mine as well as 2 smelters. The mine's expropriation took place after Glencore's subsidiary clashed violently with miners. Okay, and but also most aggressively, Pan American sued by the Bolivian government for $1.5 billion for the expropriation of the Anglo-Argentinian company's stake in natural gas producer Chaco by the state. In 2014, Bolivia settled for $357 million. The scale of these payments is enormous. It was estimated in 2014 the public and private payments made for nationalization of these key sectors amounted to at least $1.9 billion. At that time, the GDP of the country was $28 billion. So that was somewhere around 7%, maybe 7%, of GDP. If the United States had to make payments of 7% of GDP to foreign companies, because we decided to do things here that were in the interest of our people and hurt the profits of the foreign countries. 7% would amount to something like 1.5, 1.6 trillion, but off the top of my head. Something like that. Maybe 1.8 trillion. That's a lot of money as a percent, of GDP. In 2014, even the Financial Times agreed that the Morales strategy was not entirely inappropriate. Quote, proof of the success of his economic model is that since coming to power, he has tripled the size of the economy while ramping up record foreign currency reserves. And now lithium. Bolivia's key reserves are in lithium, which is essential for the electric car. They claim to have 70% of the world's reserves, of lithium, mostly in the Salar de Uyuni salt flats. The complexity of the mining and processing has meant that the country itself has not been able to develop the lithium industry on its own. It requires capital and expertise. The salt flat is about 12,000 feet, 3,600 meters above sea level, and it receives high rainfall. This makes it difficult to use sun-based evaporation. Such simpler solutions are available to Chile's Atacama Desert and in Argentina's Hombre Muerto. More technical solutions are needed, however, for Bolivia, which means that more investment is needed. The nationalization policy of the Morales government and the geographical complexity of Salar do Uyuni chased away several transnational mining firms, Eramet, which is from France, FMC from the United States, and POSCO from South Korea, could not make deals with Bolivia. So they now operate in Argentina. Evo Morales made clear that any development of lithium had to be done with the national mining company, the Camibal, and with Yacimientos de Litia Bolivianos YLB, which is the national lithium company, as equal partners. Before you view this as an outrageous deal, as some might be inclined to do, deals like this were made and received by the oil partners of the United States. In other words, the original deals that Saudi Arabia made with the United States before they totally nationalized, the oil companies there, were partnership deals of this kind. And they were 50-50 deals. That's not unusual in certain areas of the world. So it wasn't like the Bolivians were asking for something that was unprecedented. Last year, Germany's ACI Systems agreed to a deal with the Bolivians after protests from residents in the Salar de Uyuni area. That deal was canceled, by Evo Morales on November 4th of 2019. Perhaps it was that deal that was actually precipitating the coup. Who knows? Chinese firms such as TBEA Group and China Machinery Engineering have made a deal with the YLB. It was being said that the China's Tianqi Lithium Group, which operates in Argentina, was going to make a deal with the YLB. Both Chinese investment, and the Bolivian lithium company were experimenting with new ways to both to mine actually mine the lithium and to share the profits of the lithium. The idea that there might be a new social compact for the lithium was unacceptable to the main transnational mining companies. Tesla from the United States and pure energy minerals from Canada both showed great interest in having a direct stake in Bolivian the in the lithium, but they could not make a deal that would take into consideration the parameters that was set by the Morales government. Evo Morales himself was a direct impediment to the takeover of the lithium fields by the non-Chinese transnational firms. He had but to go. After the coup, Tesla stock rose astronomically. So, we have been after the Bolivians, of course, for years. We've heavily opposed the government there. But our intervention with Bolivia has been relatively soft compared to with other countries. We have not been imposing economic sanctions, for example. Perhaps because what they had control of was too important to us. But clearly, the actions of the U.S. government in supporting the coup there, rather than supporting the government, and in getting the OAS to intervene on the side of the right-wing opponents of the government, who, by the way, are veritable fascists. There's no question about that. There have been many reports of the violence that has been used by the right wing in the coup process there. Most of the initial violence was coming from the right wing, almost all of it, basically creating disorders in the country. Then the military used those disorders as a pretext to insist, that Evo Morales resign. At that point, he agreed to step down. He did step down, but he became afraid for his life. And so, upon receiving the asylum offer, from Mexico, he got on a plane and he went. And now he is comfortable there. But there are many members of his government and his party whose position in Bolivia is now very, very uncomfortable. And many of them are likely to be subjected to violence from the military and to violence from the right-wing fascists. We helped this to happen. We heavily supported it. Some of our politicians have been celebrating the coup, refusing to call it a coup, because we, of course, did not care for Morales. And so the result of this is that we are supporting another quasi-fascist or fascist government, which is now emerging in Bolivia, in South America. So we'll be supporting the Bolsonaro government, and now the Bolivian government, which is hostile to democracy. And we're doing this all under the flag of supposedly trying to facilitate democracy in Latin America. But the only thing we're really trying to facilitate is the interests of various multinational companies, including our own multinational corporations. And what we're trying to facilitate as well is that we have a secure supply, okay, of lithium for our own efforts in the solar energy, okay, and the electric car fields. We just could not tolerate the Chinese having a close relationship with the government there. That's what's behind this. There's certainly CIA money in back of the opposition, which is now taking over the government down there. So that's part of the aftermath. In other words, it's imperialism. It's straight imperialism. It's old style imperialism. Okay, it's imperialism for natural resources that do not belong to us, but that do belong to another nation whose people are entitled to the benefits, okay, of those particular resources. So, something more on Bolivia. This is from the Political Economy Research Center. There's a picture, okay, of Evo Morales, of course. But this is an interview with Pablo Solon. It was conducted by Jeffrey Weber on the 22nd of October, 2019. Now, he appeared, I believe, today on the Real News. Okay, and what Pablo Solon said, okay, on that particular news program is that he wouldn't really describe what's happened in Bolivia as quite a coup. He thought it was more complex, okay, than that. And basically, I'm sorry, he was on Democracy Now! That's where he was. Okay, and Amy Goodman, okay, was questioning him on this. Okay, and Juan Gonzalez, okay, also, okay, was questioning him. Okay, and Solon's opinion expressed on that program was that it was not a coup, okay, because or at least it was more complex than just a simple coup. Okay, is what he said. Okay, he didn't exactly say, okay, it was not a coup, but he refused to call it a coup, and he said, okay, it was more complex, okay, than that. And specifically, he said, okay, it was more complex. And the reason why it was, okay, was because, okay, when Evo wanted to run for a fourth term, he ran actually referendum on the idea. Okay, and in the referendum, he lost by 51 to 49. So the opposition won, okay, in the referendum. But then he took the question to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court argued that there couldn't be any term limits on him, even though the Bolivian Constitution had written in some term limits, because what they did is they argued that it's a human right of people to run for election as often as they want. Okay, and so Evo took that particular decision, and he ran with it, and he ran a fourth time for the presidency. He won by a vote of 47%, I believe, to 34%, which is more than the 10 points he needed in order to pass. A requirement of the Constitution was that to avoid a runoff, the leading candidate had to have a lead of 10% or over in relation to the second place candidate. Some people found that the actual result of the election was actually suspicious, because Evo was leading with 45.3%, with Carlos Mesa in second place at 38.2%, which is a lead, of course, of 7.1%. But it was claimed that the website of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal was shut down, without an explanation. It was no longer transmitting the quick count of the tabulation, of ballots after the 83% of the votes had been counted. However, the truth of the matter is, and when the count was actually resumed and the final tally was made, there then was more than a majority of 10% for Evo Morales. Now, the way others have written the story, which is unlike the way that this article gives the story, the quick count was shut down by the tribunal because the quick count was never to be the official count, and it appeared to be giving a misleading impression of what was likely to occur. The reason why things were shut down was because the count from the rural areas in Bolivia, which were heavily for Morales, those returns were coming in slowly. But that was fairly normal for the electoral process in Bolivia. That was not really unusual. The only unusual thing was that the tribunal simply decided it was going to suspend the quick count because the divergence between the quick count and the actual count as it came in was too large, and it was giving a misleading impression. So it made a decision to shut down the quick count until later. But there has been no evidence of any tampering with the actual vote. And as I said, the final count was something like 47 to 34 or 47 to 36 or something like that. So Evo did get more than the 10% required. And so there wouldn't have been a need for a runoff. However, the OAS intervened in the situation and took the situation as one where there were many irregularities in the vote. I don't think there's a lot of evidence, of that. But they called for a new election. And Evo had said that if they called for a new election, that he would agree to it. And when they did, he agreed to hold a new election. But in spite of his agreement, the military went ahead and asked him to step down anyway. Okay, so Pablo Solon is a former ambassador, okay, I believe, to the U.S. For Bolivia, and was once but very close to Evo Morales. Okay, but they had a parting of the ways because he didn't agree with what Evo was doing as the period of time, okay, when Evo was president, by war on, he began to have some disagreements. Okay, and the disagreements are recorded in this particular article. But anyway, today Solon is a director of the Fundación Solon, an institution established in 1994 by his father with the intention of fomenting the creativity and the critical perspective of rebellious spirits, quote unquote. So he's a director then of that particular foundation, and he got interviewed by Jeffrey, by R, by Jeffrey, Jeffrey, Jeffrey R. Weber. Sorry. The article says, to start with some personal background, you were the ambassador to the UN during the first term, okay, of Evo Morales. What was your role within the administration, okay, in that period, and how would you characterize the government, okay, of Evo Morales during his first term, okay, in office? So he was the ambassador to the UN, okay, not the ambassador to the United States. So that was a misstatement on my part, okay, earlier. So here it says his relation to the indigenous, okay, and peasant movements stretches back to the decade, okay, the 1990s. He says, we originally conceived of the movement towards socialism, the MAS, as a political instrument of social organizations. The objective was not to construct a political party in the traditional sense, but rather for the social movements, and in particular the peasant and indigenous movements, to have a political arm with which to intervene in elections. But with the social movement always retaining decision-making power, not the party. That, by the way, is very difficult, okay, to do. In that period, I met Evo Morales. In 2000, the water war against the privatization of water, okay, in the city, okay, of Cochabamba happened, and later the gas war and the struggle against the free trade area, okay, of the Americas. Here in Bolivia, we built a very strong movement that we called by the Bolivian Movement of Struggle Against the FTAA, which was coordinated through the Fundación Solon. In this context, as a result of the electoral court refusing to grant the legal status to the political wing of the social movements under their initial preferred name, the political instrument for sovereignty of the peoples, the leaders of the political arm opted to appropriate the already legally but defunct acronym, okay, of the MAS, which had been a party of the left, which had not been a party of the left, but radical an organization with origins in a split from a party with but phalangist characteristics. This is where the name socialist in the MAS comes from. It was thus under the banner of the MAS that the political instrument of the social movements intervened in the 2002 national elections. He said, "I was never a member of the party because we never thought it was necessary. When the MAS won the elections in 2005, AVO invited me to form a part of the government. In 2006, I formed part of a team which was charged with advising the government on themes of international politics. I was a representative on the themes of integration and trade." Okay, in that period, uh, by that period, Bolivia sat in the pro tempore presidency of what was called the UN of South America, in which I was Bolivia's ambassador. In that role, I led by the negotiation of the agreement, which constituted the Union of South American Nations. I was in charge of undoing the trade agreement we had with Mexico, okay, and of also negotiating the proposed free trade agreement with the EU, which obviously did not come to pass because the EU simply wanted us to sign off on whatever they desired. Later, I was the Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations from 2009 to 2011. So the interviewer then asked him, "How would you characterize the first administration of Evo Morales in general terms?" He said it lasted from his assumption of the presidency in 2006 to the end of 2009. It was a period of heightened polarization and confrontation in Bolivia. At the beginning, it was very difficult even to travel to some of the regions of the country which were in opposition to the government, such as Santa Cruz and Beni and Pando and Sucre, almost at the brink of civil war. The government was able to dismantle that conspiracy through fundamentally democratic mechanisms, by convening by referenda and elections. The referenda were in order to decide if the government would continue in office, as well as the prefects of the departments, which are now called the governors. There was also a referendum to approve the new constitution, followed by national elections in 2009. Support for the government went up in each of these democratic consultations, and for proposals which arose from the Constituent Assembly process. It was a period of high polarization, which in a sense had a happy ending, because Evo Morales obtained more than two-thirds in Congress and was reelected as the president in 2009. By the resistance and the sabotage of the extremely reactionary oligarchy was defeated. However, this first government already exhibited some negative elements which would later rise to the surface. The government of the mass is a government of individuals who, when they entered government, didn't have any experience of governing. The overwhelming majority had not played any part in previous governments. They were new to this, lacking experience in state administration and with uneven capacities and training. One of the mistakes the government made, for which I'm also responsible, was to involve too many leaders from social movement organizations in the administration of the government. We weakened the social organizations through the incorporation of their leaders into the state apparatus. You see that often happens. The mass movement of the social organizations was behind the government, but once you get the leaders of the mass movement actually into the state apparatus, what happens is they become a part, of the new institutions, and the bureaucracy of the state. And the bureaucracy of the state tends to become an oligarchy of its own over time. That's a process well known in the social sciences. It's the iron law of oligarchy. so-called. So the people who come from the social organizations can go into the movement. Then they become a part, of an oligarchy that's emerging in the institutions themselves. They tend to lose contact with the social organizations, the grassroots, what's going on, at the grassroots, what their perception, of needs is, and with the importance of a continuing bottom-up circulation process, which continues to refresh the elites and the institutions. Anyway, what Pablo Solon says is this is a grave error. We did not consider the importance of actually maintaining the independence of social organizations from the state. Error was to fail to recognize that within the state we were going to suffer through a process of transformation, that therefore there had to be a kind of capable counterpower process of transformation. He's talking about is the iron law, of oligarchy, and how it operates in a process, not only to exercise control over those of us who are in government, but also to transfer more areas of decision-making and action from the state towards this counterpower, of social organizations. In other words, to resist the concentration of power inside of the oligarchy and to decentralize some of the power so it's not all in the formal machinery of the state. Pablo says we did precisely the opposite. We built an ever more important cult of personality around the figure, of Evo Morales. This allowed him to win the second election overwhelmingly, but it laid the basis for the disaster that would come later. Over 2/3 of Congress had been secured, a dynamic, of actually monopolizing all the institutions of the state began. So he's describing a well-known process in the social sciences, what happens in the aftermath of a revolution. From the position of the central government, judicial power, was judicial power, judicial power by judicial power was monopolized, as was the Comptroller's Office and the Human Rights Ombudsman. It was a totally incorrect perspective to see this as the strengthening rather than the weakening of the process of change. The independence and authority between powers of the state ended up by getting abolished, and there was no counterpower from civil society. Oh, this is so well known. I mean, it happened in other places too. In Iraq, after the Baathists took over the state, the very same thing happened, and eventually the state fell under the power of Saddam Hussein there, leading to consequences that we know of extremely well. What eventually happened there is that Saddam Hussein virtually destroyed any independent power in civil society, that was in Iraq, the longer that he ruled over the country. Everything fell under the control of the power of the executive, and a government extremely personalized, around the figure of Evo Morales. After the election of 2009, there was a change of direction in the orientation of the government. In 2008, Evo put forward 10 Commandments, which was seen as necessary to save the planet, in which he opposed by biofuels, mega hydroelectric project, and by also genetically modified crops. Once he had obtained an absolute majority, he did not deepen the original program that we had, but instead sought out pacts with sectors of the opposition based on serious concessions and in particular with the agribusiness sector of the eastern lowlands, which had sabotaged his government during the first term. These concessions included everything from allowing the GMO organisms to promote biofuels, also promoting the export of meat, and not following through on the regulation of the social and economic functions, medium-sized landholding and business-scale landholdings, which allowed large landowners to preserve their ownership of land. And by the way, with the ownership of land comes power. The sectors were against the government in the first term, began to vote together with the government on almost all the laws having to do with agribusiness. For example, a law can ethanol was approved by unanimously in Congress, as much by the opposition as by the MAS. The laws that incentivize the burning of forests, laws 337, 741, 303, 1171, and others, were approved with the support of the opposition, which expressed the interest of the agribusiness elite of the departments of Santa Cruz, and Beni. So Jeffrey Weber asked, what was the motive, or the rationality of the state of the pact with the agribusiness elite? Because in a sense, they had just been defeated in political terms by 2009. But so, why would you have to negotiate, and why on their terms? And so Pablo said, the prevailing logic in the government was no longer to advance towards agroecology, but rather to guarantee governability and their next election. In other words, they had developed a dynamic where the people occupying the government wanted to stay in power, and that became their prime interest. From this perspective, it was better to have these sectors on our side so that but they no longer generated conflicts and instead supported us. In order for this to work, you have to give them some of the things they ask for. But they repeatedly asked for more, and in the end, the government ended up implementing the agribusiness program. How did the process of change benefit from this arrangement? There have been 3 terms of this government, and there is a possibility for a 4th one. Of course, now we know that there's unlikely to be a 4th one for some time, though, of course, it's not impossible for Evo to come back if the people getting into power are overthrown by the indigenous peoples. If one listens to the agribusiness sectors in meat, soy, sugar, and so on, they are very content. They have gained with this government, and they were unable to gain previously, including under neoliberal governments. In other words, what he's saying, is that Evo's government was drifting towards the same kinds of practices, as the neoliberal governments had been practicing. So Weber asked, so is this the fraction of capital with the most power in government today? So Pablo says, the government, had made an alliance with this sector in order to get certain benefits in exchange for continuity and power. They're not 2 equal partners. This agribusiness sector ultimately does not want Evo. It is profoundly oligarchic and racist, but it has been doing good business under this first indigenous government. So its logic is we do good business, they are in power, and we continue going forward. So just to underline this, it appears that the oligarchs in the United States were in back of the coup attempt, the successful coup attempt, and also in the process of violence, which was destabilizing the area, and which was giving the military the excuse to ask Evo to step down. The violent activities were highly racist. They were directed at the indigenous populations, and many of whom were hurt, and some of them were killed by basically gangs that were taking the part of the rightists and that were roaming the streets, in the major cities, and the indigenous peoples were no longer safe there. Anyway, continuing on. Therefore, in the midst of all the forest fires occurring in Bolivia at the moment, both actors, the government and the agribusiness oligarchy, have announced with jubilation the first shipment of meat to China. No other government could have done this in the midst of the tragedy of the fires. There are various studies demonstrating the large-scale impact of ranching on forest fires and on deforestation. However, the government has prioritized this alliance, thinking that it's the best way to increase the probability of re-election. Well, I'm not going to go through with the rest of this because I think my time is up here. But I think you're getting the picture here. The longer that Evo stayed in power, and the longer his party stayed in power, it became concerned with continuing to stay in power, and this led to compromises with the very sectors of society that wanted to throw Evo out and throw the indigenous people of the country out, of power, and basically either stop or reverse the very important trends that he, had introduced into society. In other words, they wanted to end they wanted to end the whole process, of the social revolution that he was attempting to implement. And when he began to compromise with them, he began to slow down his process, and he began to undermine his own power by strengthening them. And they were strengthened because they were doing well under him. So he didn't prosecute the revolution to the end. Instead, he began to compromise in order to stay in power. But also, in the end, these sectors but did not want his continuing rule. When he resisted the outcome of the constitutional referendum of 2016, which said no to his trying to run again at the end of his term, he, through the control that he exercised over the constitutional tribunal, he illegally modified the Constitution with a totally absurd argument that the right of indefinite re-election is a human right. So that's where Pablo Solon really parted company, with Evo, because he thought that what Evo did with the constitutional tribunal was anti-democratic. Because nowhere else that I know of has it actually been asserted that the right of indefinite The right to run for office, okay, on an indefinite basis is a human right. That's the first time I ever heard that, okay, asserted. So obviously the fix was in there, and that's part of the background for the coup. Now, when all that's said and done, there's no doubt, though, that what happened in Bolivia was still a coup, because when you have a military that intervenes and deposes, okay, an elected president, as Evo was, even though he should not have been running in the first place, he still was an elected president from his previous election when he was adhering to the Constitution, and he was not due to leave office until the 20th of January. So their attempt, successful attempt, to depose him, at this time, and to take him out of office, and to take his immediate successors out of office, as well, that disrupted the legally constituted presidential term, and so it can only be called a military coup. The situation may have been more complex, and it may have been it may have actually followed, an abuse of power by Evo Morales. But the fact is, he still had the rest of his term to play out until January 20th. And they deposed him more than 2 months before that. So, it is a military coup. Okay, so going on. And Jeffrey Weber says, okay, this is your sense of the party terrain. You mentioned earlier that a critical error of the first term of his rule was the integration of social movement leaders into the state. Turning to the area of social movements, then, what is your take on their power and significance in the current conjuncture? Okay, and Pablo Solon says it's very poor. We all wanted the government to win a second term in 2009 and to win, but decisively to put an end, to the resistance of the oligarchy. But very shortly after obtaining 2/3 in Congress, the ideology that came to prevail within government circles, of which the Vice President Alvaro Garcia Alvaro Garcia Linera, is the purest expression, said, "We don't accept independent thinkers. There can be no independent thinkers. Here, everyone must agree with what Evo Morales and Alvaro Garcia Linera say." So that was really the key parting of the ways, I think, when that became a doctrine inside of the party. So what they have done is weaken social organizations, transforming them into simple echoes of the government's line without a critical or a positive program of their own. The social movements are in a much worse state than they were prior to the water war of 2000. They have less capacity for autonomy, for projecting demands, for self-determination. Okay, by the way, this is completely different, actually, from the Venezuelan situation, where local community groups were established all throughout the country, as organs, of governance. They strongly support the government there, and the regime, but they have ideas of their own all the time, which are percolating up, actually, from the bottom. So there is a long-term democratic structure that was established there. And that is a very important difference, evidently, from what happened in the Bolivian situation. I think that's very interesting, anyway, that kind of distinction. Those which have confronted the government have been divided, criminalized, and in some cases incarcerated. Fear has been generalized within the government. There are many people who disagree with the official line, but they're not going to say this publicly because they'll lose their jobs. Anyone who wants to keep their job has to accept the line coming from above. It's a type of totalitarianism which is distinct from military dictatorships. There are some cases in which the mechanisms are more perverse and in others more subtle, designed to keep quiet those who have a position that is different. And Jeffrey Weber says, in the present conjuncture, what is the position of the most important business confederations such as CANCO, the Chamber of Industry and Commerce in Santa Cruz? Are they openly supporting some parties more than others? What are the desires of domestic and international capital in these elections? And Pablo says they're not going to say anything publicly. What they hope is to be able to continue their business, to continue their business no matter who wins. Okay, if Evo wins, they'll continue alongside Evo. If the opposition wins, then they will go along with it. At the moment, they're not involved in any public campaign in favor of one or another candidate, but simply thinking of their pockets. Well, since then, of course, the situation has changed. And so I suppose Pablo now thinks that they're going to go along with the military coup and whoever emerges out of it as a new government, of Ecuador. And Weber asked, but apart from their apparent neutrality, then you don't think they're financing specific parties? Do they have a preferred outcome? Pablo Solon says, well, they haven't said anything publicly, so one cannot say with any evidence. Weber says there's no publicly available financing of any particular campaigns. Okay, Pablo says, public? No. Behind the scenes, all the parties must be receiving something. Okay, for example, Bolivia says no, the party of Oscar Ortiz surely has the financial support of agribusiness. They are the party which most closely represents their interests. Their platform is to export the Santa Cruz model to the rest of the country. They want to introduce a new export plan for the Amazon. The Santa Cruz oligarchy has learned that first it has to protect its business interests. And so it's not going to confront the government when they are receiving the benefits that they're receiving. They're not going to campaign openly against the government. Under the table, they might be financing here or there, but they know that they know that the Bolivia says no faction has no chance of winning these elections. So why would they say anything but publicly? So JRW then asks, how do you explain the economic growth in your country in contrast, say, to the open crises in Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, and elsewhere? Is it going to last, or has the crisis simply not yet arrived in Bolivia? And Pablo says, here as elsewhere, we lived through a boom in spite of the crisis of 2008 because of the price of commodities. And in particular, the oil price continued climbing until 2014. And the crisis began that year when the price of oil began to fall. Until 2014, we in various countries in the region were in ascent thanks to an export model rooted in certain products that enjoyed high price on the international market. Crisis began here when the price of oil fell to almost $40 per barrel, having reached a high of $100 per barrel, and the price of oil impacted upon the price of our natural gas sales to Argentina, and to Brazil. The government was able to accumulate enormous foreign reserves during the boom period. Our reserves reached 15 billion. Before the Morales government, uh, our reserves never surpassed 1 or 2 billion. In order to avoid the repercussions of the crisis, the government began to spend its foreign reserves and began to take on debt. Today, the external debt is around 25% of GDP and is growing. The government also sells national treasury bonds on Wall Street, which is another form of indebtedness. In this way, the crisis has been alleviated. The government has controlled the crisis in anticipation of the October elections. At that time, what Pablo predicts is that whoever wins the elections, there will be an economic austerity package because it's almost impossible to maintain an exchange rate of 6.96 Bolivianos to the dollar when one looks at the fall of currencies in Argentina and in Brazil. Unfortunately, these investments by the state have not been in viable, productive sectors. There's been a lot of investment in infrastructure investments, but directed towards the productive sectors that have been very poorly chosen. For example, the sugar mill in San Buenaventura, or the urea plant. That is, these investments haven't generated a new productive but haven't generated a new productive economic matrix capable of generating resources in the short term. And he goes on, in this way. He says after the elections, they're going to see an increase in gas, diesel, and electric light on the tariffs. So JRW asks, but do you think Evo is going to win in the first round? Is there any possibility that he's not going to win the election? Pablo Solon says, I don't know, because ours is a very volatile country. Yeah. A month ago, everything suggested, that Evo would win in the first round, but now I don't know. The impact of the ecological disaster of the forest fires will have an effect on his chances. Whether he will recover or not in the coming days and weeks, we don't know. In any case, no one is going to win in the first round. There's going to be a second round. But today, I don't think it's possible that Evo will win in the first round. But the situation could change. Ours is a very dynamic country. Okay, there were some other important questions, that were asked, but I've run way over my time, so, I'm going to end this now. But you can see from what I've gone through so far, that Pablo Solon is a very perspicacious analyst, to say the least. He understands the societal dynamics very well. Uh, and he understands what kind of fixes the country, is in. Uh, and so Weber asked a question which is very, very important, which I will go through. He said, what is the strategy then for people such as yourself who are trying to maintain a leftist position independent from that of the government? What to do in the present moment? Should the emphasis be on rebuilding a movement from below over the medium to long term? Pablo Solon says, I don't think there's any other alternative. Between the two existing electoral poles, there is no alternative. We have to build and rebuild something different and learn from our mistakes, because we had strong movements until 2006, until we arrived in the government. So we have to be very self-critical concerning the errors we committed so that the new movements do not repeat them. this point, a dichotomy between the left and the right is not essential. We're not talking about building another big boss politician, Codillo, with which to confront Evo Morales or another neoliberal party. We're talking about rebuilding the social fabric of social movements and of new actors so that they can begin to self govern and self organize. That kind of government today is very incipient in Bolivia. He says 14 years ago, it wasn't the case. There was a very mobilized, autonomous, and self governing movement. To recompose that will be very difficult. The worst aspect is that this disarticulation of social movements on the social subject was not done by a government of the right, but by a government of the left. The social subject was able to survive despite the repression and brutality of the dictatorships and the policies of the neoliberal governments. At certain moments, it was severely damaged. But under this government, our own government, government that we brought to office, a terrible phenomenon has been produced. The Aymara and Quechua indigenous community, which resisted colonization for 500 years, is today very weak because an indigenous government is promoting a very consumerist, developmentalist perspective of Western uh, uh, the perspective of Western modernity. As a result, Aymara and Quechua communities and their alternative vision of living well uh, 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 is weaker today than before the arrival of this government. It should have been exactly the opposite scenario. And it goes on, okay, and on. And then he gets to the question of what kind of economic transition then is needed in Bolivia. He said, what the government should have done is what we had originally proposed. When we arrived in government, we said we're not going to support agribusiness. We're going to support communitarian agroecology, which is going to preserve nature, fundamentally directed toward the local market. But the government, prioritizing its re-election, uh, um, actually preferred to make agreements with agribusiness, and this is the result. And he says other options are possible, and he talks about the other options. And I urge you to read this, but that's just about the end of it. I have a very strong feeling, okay, that this guy Pablo is a fairly objective observer. Now he's obviously nursing a extreme anger and dissatisfaction and regret towards the direction that Evo took the revolution and after 2000, okay, and 9. The perspective that Pavlo Solon has is an eco-socialist type. Okay, that's the perspective. Okay, Evo moved more towards an agribusiness perspective. Okay, because he wanted to compromise. Okay, to stay in office, and this has had severe consequences for the economy and for the social movements. Okay, themselves. What Evo did over a long period of time was to weaken the social movements, and so this time they weren't able to carry him to victory. They may technically have won this last election, okay, or final um, election. But what Evo should have done was to have let some other leader rise from the social movements, kept the social movements active, let them generate other leaders apart from himself that were committed to the vision of eco-socialism. And then after a decent period of time, he should have turned over to the party leadership to somebody else, or the movement leadership, okay, to somebody else. Instead, he basically deactivated the social movements and undermined the indigenous basis for the social movements through his consumerism, okay, and the developmentalism. And that's what really created the situation in Bolivia we have now, which evidently, according to Solon, and he may well be right, is not a very hopeful situation. It will probably take a long time to reconstruct the power of the social movements and social organizations, okay, that are based on the Mara and Quechua cultures. So that's all for now. I'm going to now check in with you and see how you're doing. If there are any of you still hanging in with me right now, I have no idea how many of you are, but let's see. Here we go. Oh, still? Okay, there are evidently still 5 of you. Thank you. But maybe there aren't 5 because I might not have. Because my screen might have been frozen for a long time. Anyway, I am going to refresh my page. It seems like I evidently have 6 right now. Okay, I'm going to refresh my page. Excuse me for a moment. Now, I find myself on a watch party, and I do not find myself where I want to go. Hopefully, I will still be live when I get there. Okay, I think I'm back. Steve says, "Thank you, sir." Okay, another great show. Thank you, Steve. We got a lot of thank yous. Nice to have the thank yous. I see a few of you are still here. Are there any questions or comments? Steve says, "You almost need a really strong leader like Fidel to keep these bastards from doing a coup. I've spent months at a time in Cuba. It's really quite wonderful, okay, in my opinion, in spite of all of the economic sanctions by the U.S. over years and years and years. It's really amazing." Yes, Social Security is and always has been a political choice. Yes, Steve Gonzo, you're absolutely right. They take it out of your Social Security payments, of which you're taxed on, as well as since Reagan. Uh, right, but that doesn't change the fact that it is not free to us. Steve Gonzo, yes, they choose to tax us. It is not necessary to pay for Social Security by forcing people to make any payments into a non-existent Social Security trust fund. But at the same time, they do that. And Steve Wolfbrand said, I believe AMRO will protect AVO. Yes, I do too. I think AMLO is going to protect him as well. And that he will be free, okay, in Mexico. He's not going to be imprisoned. What are the odds on the U.S. trying to extradite him? What grounds does the U.S. have to extradite AVO? I mean, he never did anything to Americans. He never committed any crimes. He's not accused of any crimes involving Americans. Okay, and Lana asks whether Morales was invited to the Vatican with Bernie a few years ago. I don't know, Lana. I don't actually recall. And Steve says Gary Webb committed suicide, shot himself twice in the brain. And Steve Wolfbrand says that Seth Rich is dead, and Epstein didn't kill himself. He's probably still alive. No, I think that Epstein probably did kill himself. And Steve asks, have I noticed all the coup bots? Okay, no new accounts, no friends, no posts supporting opposition views. Steve says, I know, Lana. And Max Blumenthal was arrested. Okay. Also, Medea Benjamin has been arrested. Ava was in exile. Oh, well, Medea Benjamin, okay, is always arrested. And then she gets out very quickly. Okay, Max, okay, has gotten out. He had to spend 36 hours, okay, in lockup. And they were treating him, okay, extremely poorly. But he's out now. Susie Dawson is in exile with Snowden. Julian Assange is nearly dead. Kay Manning is locked up. All that is true. And Steve says, I believe Afghanistan has $1 trillion worth of rare earth metals, not to mention heroin poppies. Sons and daughters of our original soldiers are now eligible to serve there. Okay, it's a never-ending war. No wonder they wanted him out. Okay, Bolivia, on AVO. Okay, literacy in 2006 was 13.0%. 2018 it was 2.4%. Unemployment in 2006 was 9.2%. In 2018 it was 4.1%. Poverty was 60.6. In 2018, 34.6. Extreme poverty was in 38.2%. 2018, 15.2%. So he cut also extreme poverty by more than 50%, and just poverty by close to 50%. A really great record. A really great record. There's no question he did, enormous amount for his country. Russ says, I've got to call it a night. I'll see you again soon. Thank you, Russ. Thanks for being here. Okay. And Russ said Andres Brunel shared this article on his feed and said, I found it interesting. Yeah, it really is interesting. I think it's a great piece. Rob says, one other thing I wanted to mention is how one big puzzle piece that isn't talked about in finance is fiscal policy. We talk all day about the markets, futures, contracts, derivatives, okay, mutual funds, bonds, okay, monetary policy, and most definitely interest rates. But nowhere is there anything about monetary sovereignty or where does our money come from. If we do, it's talk about fiscal spending. It's always in a negative position where too much printing money leads to inflation and capital flight. It's the most frustrating thing for me. Well, it's just nonsense, You have to sit through nonsense, okay, to get a degree. Steve says, Dr. Joe is dropping a lot of truth tonight. I always drop a lot of truth, huh? Don't I? Yes, as a matter of fact, I've always watched RT. Actually, not as much as I did. The reason being that I watch a lot of alternative sources now, but I still watch RT frequently, and also Telesur. I think is a very important source, okay, of news that you can't get from our conventional sources. I don't watch our conventional sources much. And Lana said, the picture is not frozen for me. Actually, it was frozen for me. So I thought there must be something wrong with it. I shouldn't have concluded that. Okay, a lot of nice comments tonight, and thank you very much. I hope for more shares. Uh, and when this gets onto YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. Yeah, the person taking over now says, quote, I dream of a Bolivia free of the indigenous satanic satanic rituals. The city isn't for the Indians. Let them go to the highlands or the swamp plains, unquote. Yeah, that not a good person to turn over the government to, or to have or to whose hands the government should fall. She's a real villain. So moving down the list of comments now. Margaret Shepard says, thank you, Dr. Joe. Who wrote that? Okay, I see 4 of you are still here. Thank you for being still here. Please don't forget, okay, my Patreon account at Joseph at, I'm sorry, www.patreon.com/Joe underscore Firestone. That's my Patreon account. So please do contribute on occasion. Even $1 a month will help. It will be a big help. Someone posted one for New Economic Perspectives. If you really care about Social Security, stop capitulating to the left. That is a classic article by Stephanie. I've written a number of articles myself based on the views she expressed in that article. She did a very, very good job with it. So, I am going to say good night. I'm glad you liked this show, or at least that some of you liked it. I will be back tomorrow. I'll probably be editing the title of this show as well as soon as I end it. So, good night. Have a wonderful day tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow night.